So let me start just with a brief time schedule. We'll have a discussion until 7:15. Then Robert Kilian has to leave because he's in a big hurry, and we're really, really glad you could make it. But he's excused. So we'll talk until 7:15, and then we have 30 minutes for questions from the audience. Let's start with our first panelist. He's a partner at Noerr, Frankfurt office. He's a member of the Noerr Banking and Finance Group. He's one of the leading experts on banking law. He advises national, international banks, financial services providers, payment institutions, fund initiators, and asset managers on various aspects of banking regulation. His practice also, among others, focuses on the design of FinTech business models, as well as assisting clients with different aspects of transactions in the field of funds and M&A. Let's give a big welcome to Jens Kunz. Okay, so my first question for you is, since you advise FinTechs, among others, I assume you have a good overview of what's going on right now in Germany. So what's your take on the development of the FinTech industry here?
Yeah, first of all, many thanks for the kind introduction. And I think what is really noteworthy is the development in the last 4 years. When I started advising FinTech companies or being interested in FinTech developments 4 years ago, it was a sort of exotic topic. And when I went to events, for example, and talked to regulators, and asked, well, how do you see this and that issue from a regulatory perspective with regard to FinTech companies, then sometimes at least they just answered, well, FinTech, I don't know anything about FinTechs. And this definitely changed. If you take a look today at events like this one, we have Ms. Dietze here, or the FinTech camp from the BMF last year, or from BaFin, though the consciousness of the relevance of FinTech has been tremendously developed since then. And I think that is the most remarkable thing, that people are talking about FinTech, and now not only talking about FinTech, but also business models developed. So, for example, 2 years ago, many people talked about blockchain, but now the industry is actually trying to develop use cases and business models for the blockchain industry. So I think from this perspective, there has been made really significant progresses. And what I also want to say in this regard is that the banking industry itself changed. So 4 or 5 years ago, the banks especially, they didn't, or they ignored FinTech and the developments. And then 2 years ago, they perceived FinTech companies as a sort of opponent. They didn't want to compete with them. And nowadays, you see that they want to cooperate with them. So trying to agree on corporations or to invest in FinTech companies, that's also a remarkable development.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next panelist, she studied law in Trier and Münster, and started a very typical administrative career, which brought her to the Ministry of Finance, first in the payments division. Then for 2 years, no kidding, for 2 years she wrote speeches and texts for the Minister of Finance. And obviously these texts and speeches were so good that she got to be the head of the newly founded division on digital finance and payment services. And recently she negotiated the Payment Services Directive 2 on the German side, and was also in charge of its implementation, which just happened quite recently in Germany. Let's give a big welcome to Doris Dietze. So, Ms. Dietze, what does the Ministry of Finance do to facilitate FinTech and cope with the challenges that FinTech is posing?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I'm just glad that the slide saying financial regulation is risky is not on anymore above my head. Well, the Ministry of Finance has undertaken several measures during the last years to cope with the chances and get an idea of the risks of new technologies. And I would like to mention maybe 3, and I think we will come to some more later. First of all, it is for us very important to understand what is going on there outside, to understand technologies. We are quite good in legislation. We are not always experts on technology. What we did is, the one thing is, you already mentioned, is we set up the new unit being responsible for technologies, but not only FinTechs. That is really important for me to stress. It's a broader approach. It's about technology as a whole, digitalization from old and new players, which have some differences and some similarities. Furthermore, we set up a FinTech Rat, is it called, expert group, which gives us some advices on how technology works, what is out there, which are the chances, which are the risks going along with them. For example, N26 sitting next to me is one of the members, but there are also academics, members of the council, as well as old players like banks or insurances, new players like startups covering all different businesses in the financial service area, like robo-advice or payments, just to name some. And the third point is what we did is we put the topic on the international agenda. Germany had the G20 presidency this year, and digital finance was one of the priorities there. And of course, on the international level, the most things which got discussed were which impact do FinTechs have on the financial stability. And since I'm seeing, just before I finish, Professor Harnoff sitting there, one of the first things we did in the Ministry of Finance is we published a study conducted by him to get an idea how big the market is and how it looks like in Germany. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the next panelist. He is General Counsel at number 26, bank, and responsible for legal affairs and compliance and public affairs. I think it's safe to say that his opus magnum was obtaining a full-fledged banking license for number 26, which was a big thing. I remember the discussions going on, everybody was saying, number 26, they got a banking license, or they're going to have a banking license, they're applying for a banking license. This is something which was really a big thing, I think, in the whole industry. Welcome, Robert Kilian. Robert, as an industry participant, are you happy with, first of all, I should maybe say that, as you can, this is spontaneous, right? So we haven't talked about the questions beforehand, with a couple of exceptions. Robert doesn't know what I'm going to ask him. So let's go.
I'm afraid already.
Are you happy with what the Ministry of Finance is doing to felicitate FinTechs in Germany?
Yes, no joking here. Yes, we are. To sum it up, yes, we are. Especially if you see, or if you compare like the efforts that we see throughout different countries and the national supervisory bodies and their efforts when it comes to financial technology, I can truly say that that Germany, and I mean not only the ministries, but also BaFin, also Bundesbank, that they, of course, they took like much effort in the past. And what I really can say is that they're really interested to get to know the business and that they really understand the business. And this is something, I'm not going to tell you any names of foreign bodies here, but you can be sure that there are other national regulatory authorities that do not understand the business in every case, I'm pretty sure. And this is like really interesting and good to see that when it comes to Germany and the German legislator and the German national supervisory authorities, there's not only interest, there's only really some understanding for the business models.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, the last panelist, Doug, I don't have to introduce you because I already did. So you, in your presentation, you talked about the risks of financial regulation, and two of those risks were having regulators do the law and having politicians do the law. Now, I am afraid that not having regulators, neither regulators nor politicians do the law is an option which is not feasible, at least not in Germany. So if we accept that there must be regulators and politicians, what would your general advice be to them?
Great, tricky problem. And a number of you in the room have met my better half. I married my co-author. She's got so many great, colorful quotes, and one of my favorite from her is one where she said, if you pay people peanuts, you get monkeys, right? And so what the reason I think of this immediately is that it tells you something about incentive structures. And so some places around the world really give people the right incentive structures in their political system and in the regulatory system. And one example I have in my head is Singapore seems to have done this in a very perfect way, where the right incentives seem to be put in place in so many contexts. And tricky thing that you have within other regulators, and not necessarily to beat up on any specific cases, but that you can put in better sets of incentives to get the right outcome. So one complaint sometimes that some people have is that regulators might have an incentive to be excessively risk averse because there's little upside to doing a new thing and tremendous downside to doing something that was permitted but shouldn't have been permitted, and the result of that might be excessively onerous regulation as one possible outcome, and I alluded to that as one of the regulatory things that we saw in Canada. So that's perhaps one approach, and I could say other things about our political system, but I'll stop right here before I get myself into trouble.
My follow-up question would have been if economists believe in intrinsic motivation. Obviously, they don't. Okay, so another question for Doris Dietze. What's your take on the status quo of regulation? Would you consider it friendly or opposed to FinTechs? Do you think it's a good environment to come up with new ideas of financial innovation?
When I'm looking on what is happening on the market at the moment, especially in Germany, and I see a lot of new ideas and business models coming up, and a lot of new technologies just being somehow tried. I do not have the impression that we are so wrong with our regulation. So, nevertheless, I think for us it is important to focus on the risk. I'm not sure if you would like or if you would like a regulator which is risky in any case. So, and we try to be neutral, technology neutral. That is one point. So we say we are looking on what you're doing, and then we look at what risks could be implied, or if you may have, if you're not risky at all, could also be an assumption. And then we'll think at the moment that our current legal system fits the purpose in general quite well. So if you're, for example, if you're dealing in payments, it doesn't matter if you're a new company or an old one, if you're a traditional bank or if you're a startup, or even, I don't know, whatever business. As soon as you're if you're dealing with payments, you fall under a certain regulation. And this regulation says you in general need a permit and get it supervised by BaFin, but nevertheless, the regulation also provides for some flexibility to say you're dealing with payments, but it's a less risky area you're working in, then you get an exemption. For example, you can get an exemption if you're just dealing with payments in the area or in a limited scope or limited network. Or maybe if you're only dealing with donations. So, and then you do not need a license and you not get supervised. So I think our current legal system is both, they regulate risks, or risk-orientated, but they leave still some flexibility for less risky activities.
All right. So we heard a very optimistic, or rather quite optimistic assessment of the status quo of regulation, and Robert Kilian confirmed this view. Jens Kunz, is this what your clients tell you too? And what's your take as an advisor? Would you also confirm those views?
Well, I would say it depends on the structure of the clients. If you have startups as clients, they tend to complain about regulation in general because it's costly and time-consuming. So, for example, the permit question. Startup entrepreneurs usually want to start right now, not in 6 months, not next year. They want to do the business next week. And this is not possible if you need a permit, because this is a complex application process, and you need to take into account 6 months or even 12 months. Maybe Robert can say something to the timeline for N26. So. But then you need to explain to them, well, it will take some time, and we try to advise you in a pragmatic matter, and usually then they understand it. If you advise FinTechs which participate in the business for a couple of months or years, they understand how things go. And well, they just want to know what are the exceptions they could take advantage of, or what are the legal challenges, and then they just want to cope with those challenges. And what we also see is that FinTechs perceive regulation also as a chance. For example, in the PSD2 context, so they say, well, if we have a regulation which accommodate our special situation, for example, the payment initiation services or the account service providers, they have not to fulfill the same requirements in future, starting next year, than a fully fledged payment institution. And they like this approach, because then they could tell their clients, well, see, we are regulated, and the burden is not that cumbersome as for other payment institutions. So it really depends on the type of client you are advising, and also if you advise in the payment sector or in the bank sector, because the bank sector, if you're a fully fledged bank with a full banking license, then I think as a really FinTech, meaning that you are not that mature, it's not an easy task to fulfill the entire set of regulatory requirements.
You just mentioned the timeline, and I think this leads to a very important topic, and this is BaFin, the national regulator of the financial industry. I remember at the FinCamp in 2016, BaFin was a big topic. I think there was a special workshop dedicated to BaFin, to whether they have the right personnel, whether the structures are okay for FinTech. Could you maybe elaborate a little on what has been going on at BaFin since early 2016?
They have taken several measures as well, so they are getting faster. I got the impression, and they are getting faster when it comes to the licensing process or also the answering process of questions. And what is even as important is that they get more open to communicate. And this is I always call it a two-side learning process. The BaFin is learning how to deal with new, young, innovative businesses which approach them in a different way than traditional banks did. And on the other side, these young, innovative businesses somehow learn and make their first experiences with a regulator. And this is for them not easy too. So, but as you both actually said, both sides are learning and getting better. BaFin had also set up a certain unit for technologies, for new technologies, and where they also analyze the impact of blockchains or ICOs and what that could mean for financial stability or also the regulator. On one side, and on the other side, they're also strengthening their licensing unit to get faster and interconnected to just be also more service-oriented.
Okay. Do you agree, Robert? What's your experience, especially with BaFin, during the process of obtaining a banking license?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with Doris Dietze. I would say what we see is really a development, especially when it comes to the new so-called FinTech task force that we have at BaFin. Back then in beginning 2016, I think it was not already established, was like at the end of 2016 or beginning 2017. But what we really see is also some development when it comes to other departments at BaFin, because of course as a bank, as a fully licensed bank in Germany, you have to deal with separate departments throughout BaFin. And so what I can really see also if I'm comparing those departments is really a development when it comes to faster answers, when it comes to a very simple example, when it comes to the way they answer throughout emails, because like in the beginning we had like some examples where they really like do the written form, where we really like received mail, which is like really can be really a problem for a startup because some of them don't have a mailbox, like a physical mailbox. So that's only one example. So I really think we have some developments here, and I think what we can do, or what BaFin can do, is of course also maybe look a little bit after like other countries and after national regulatory authorities, and of course we have always the discussion with sandboxes and so on and so on. So what we see in the UK, the development in the UK, I'm not saying that this is a good idea to put the sandbox up like for tomorrow within BaFin, because I know that you need to like shift the capacity and stuff like that. But I'm just saying we should be like still in discussions throughout the next couple of weeks and months if that could be a possibility. And of course, like the first requirement would be that this can really work. A sandbox, for example, that enough capacity is sourced within BaFin, so that this really makes sense.
That's a very good point. It would have been my next question. So the regulatory sandbox, it's a concept of providing liberty, freedom from certain regulatory constraints, where possible, for young FinTech companies to develop their business model and be in close touch with the regulator, so the regulator can learn about this model and can regulate it later on in a much wiser fashion. That's the promotion of the sandbox. This is the basic idea if you look at it from an optimistic point of view. Let's start maybe with Douglas Cumming. You, as someone who has no stakes in Germany whatsoever, do you think that's a good idea, or would you be careful implementing such concept?
Well, I just maybe give a political answer in terms of not answering the question you asked. But the thing that I've seen with startups dealing most effectively with regulation, and even established companies, is they first go to the regulator So the startups that are really effective at doing something new and not having regulatory problems is that they actually go to the regulator and say, this is what we're interested in doing, and explaining to them that it's new, it's different, you probably doesn't fit into a pigeonhole, as we say as lawyers, and this might cause you concern, but this is what we're doing, so you have no uncertainty about thinking about this, and you're not surprised later by finding out about it from someone else. And then that seems to work extremely well, and regulators seem to like that a lot. So as one example of that, nearby my house in Toronto, there's a venture capitalist who, this is a bit of an aside, he didn't, inflate his deals that hadn't yet sold, which made his fundraising harder. People inflate their unsold deals to raise money from their institutional investors. So he didn't have enough money. So what he did is for his current fund. So what he did is he's crowdfunding half of his deals. Each deal is half crowdfunded. And so when he started doing this, he got in touch with me, am I allowed to do this? And so I had a response, well, I'm actually not sure, because we didn't yet have equity crowdfunding rules or anything. And so he physically went to the regulator. The regulator liked that he was doing this, and that got the ball moving in a non-trivial way. So that's the best sort of anecdote about how, that I could give about how entrepreneurs can mitigate these risks of regulation by actually going to the regulator.
Just if you want to answer directly, just do it. If you don't, I think my question would be, the regulatory sandbox, it was my perception, had been taken off the political agenda very quickly by, if I remember correctly, both the president of BaFin, Felix Hufeld, who said we don't need this, and also from the Ministry of Finance, although I'm not sure about the latter. Is this perception correct, or do you think it could be on the political agenda? Maybe, and maybe as a follow-up question, do you think that Brexit will bring in some new dynamic, perhaps?
Okay, I think it's hard to speculate on the upcoming political agenda at the moment. And of course, Brexit will have an effect on Germany as a whole, probably, and on the financial market. But with regard to the sandbox, maybe, the sandbox word is always so shiny, and everyone, I got the impression, seems to understand something different when it comes to the details on it. So and we looked at the UK sandbox very closely. We also sent over a colleague from the BaFin to get an idea how it is working and if this is something we could adapt in Germany. And we just came to the result also because, or in other words, also the UK sandbox, as far as I know, does not exempt from existing regulation, which would be difficult, especially with regard to European legislation. Which is
mandatory law, of course, exactly. It's not possible.
So, and that led us to the conclusion that between a UK sandbox and a very service-oriented supervisory authority, there's not much of a difference. And I totally agree. I think the best is that you get in contact with your local supervisor as soon as possible and discuss the ideas you have. And then, of course, you get an answer what is possible or what means what from a regulatory perspective. And I think this is something which I would call simply service-oriented service-oriented behavior of a supervisory authority, and would not need the word sandbox for it. Okay. So far.
So we try to do the same, but don't call it sandbox?
I'm not sure if we're really doing the same. I would say we're trying to do it something similar, but we don't call it sandbox.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another, the regulatory oversight is just a really important subject here in the realm of FinTech. So another common complaint, I think, from the industry is that when you set up a business model, you don't only have to deal with the requirements of financial regulation, but of other types of regulation which can be very cumbersome. For example, data protection. I think that's a common feature, because when you have a FinTech model, you often use big data, and then you need a completely different agency to talk to about completely different questions under completely different law. So a common complaint which I've heard several times is that why can't BaFin answer any questions about data protection? And I mean, it seems, of course, to us, it seems, yeah, well, because that's not their task, they're not competent to do this, but wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of general agency to deal with these problems, or to set up a new agency consisting of different members of different agencies to tackle this problem? Let's maybe ask Robert Kilian first, because you must have had some issues with data protection as well, and then Jens Kunz.
Yeah, absolutely. Like maybe no issues exactly, but of course, like we are under the supervisory also of the data security supervision here in Berlin. I think the first problem is, of course, that Berlin is like a regional authority, and of course you have the BaFin, which is a national authority. So I don't know, like, about the competencies and how they can allocate this to make this really easy and quick for us. But to answer your question, exactly. Of course, like for startups like us, where we are bigger startups, it would be nice. But even more for startups that have like 10 people, 20 people. Of course, it's not at all. It's like it's a big effort, a very big effort. If you have the data security audit, if you have these like the auditors like in there for 3 or 4 days, and you really bound 4 to 5 people or whatever out of a 20 people team only on data security audit topics for 1 week. This is almost a total stop for the product. And of course, like, what should happen here is maybe not like to centralize those functions or like shift them to BaFin, but what I wish to have is basically more sensibility. When it comes to the data security audits, a sensibility when it comes to BaFin audits, of course, also a sensibility when it comes to other audits, also the annual audits that you have, and that they really have the sensibility for proportionality, like that they really look at is this a big company or is this a small company? What kind of product do they have? Because of course, as we all know, like the risk that is in the company and the risk of doing financial business is very much related on what kind of business you are doing. Yeah, if you're like simply doing, I don't know, credits, or you're doing deposit business, only deposit business, that's something totally different if you're like compared to if you're doing like the complete business, beginning from deposit, credit, into high yield bonds, for example. And this is something I think where we, but also most of the other startups, really wish the authorities, and especially maybe also the data security authorities and annual auditors, to look a little bit more after the size of the company when they start and or contemplate the audit.
Yeah, to answer your first question regarding one single authority, of course it would be nice, as you said, but I think we also need a sense for what is really realistic. And it's like you go to a lawyer, it would be great if only one lawyer could answer any question, but that will not happen. So I'm not able to answer all the questions on financial regulation and cybersecurity and so forth. And I think it's the same with BaFin. Even if you would centralize everything in one super authority, then you would still have various departments. And I'm not sure whether then the entire process would go more smoother than now. That's to the first question. And then the second one, what Robert mentioned, I think that is quite important, and it goes into the direction of the sandbox model. Proportionality, that's a big issue currently in the banking sector. Not only for FinTechs, but also for small banks. And I think oftentimes we have in the statutory law provisions granting discretion for taking into account the size and complexity of the business. But indeed, I think this discussion could be used more broadly. So, for example, if you have the EMA risk, certain requirements on risk management, these are guidelines published by BaFin, then oftentimes it does not really make sense to apply them strictly as they are written in the guidelines. And to have more flexibility in applying these requirements, I think that would be possible under current law and would definitely make a lot of sense.
All right, so why don't we turn from FinTechs to banks, just for a second maybe. It's funny because we always try to get representatives of banks on this panel. And the answer always is we find your conference very interesting, but we cannot say anything about this topic publicly. So let us talk about the banks publicly for a second. Doug, do you think that big banks will still exist in 10 years?
Yeah, you know, there's some interesting things going on with bank involvement in FinTech. And the best discussion I had recently about this was, and I, you know, I'm Canadian. I know I'm overdoing it with the Canadian examples, but I'm sorry, I'm Canadian. There's a Canadian bank that's intentionally trying to disrupt itself. So they're making huge investments. One such investment is this startup called Wealthsimple, where I think they've now got, through an intermediary, so through a fund, they've got 150 million invested in it. And it's going to do a variety of good things, partly of which is going to disrupt part of their business model. But the smarter ones really understand that many of the current things aren't viable going forward. And instead of trying to, you know, block it or protect it or, you know, keep the disruptive set of fees or whatever the case may be, they're making active investments in disrupting themselves, which I think is really cool.
Robert, so Jeff Bezos, I think, said, your margin is my profit, or your margin is my opportunity. And that's exactly what you're doing with big banks. So do you think big banks will still exist in 10 years?
I think the question is not, this is maybe a question that is more related to the regulatory framework that we will have then, because like what are banks? What banks are is basically, it's like related to what we have in the law, right? What is in the legislation, not at all.
But will they be big?
Yes, I think if a bank or a company at all is big or not is more depending on, that's exactly our point, is more depending on the fact if the product is good or not. Yeah? If you really have a product that is accessible for the customer, if you really have a product that is user-friendly, where you really can like exaggerate some user experience, and I think it will be more the question, will there be like enough traditional banks in 10 years that have been also able like to build products that the people really love.
Okay, so now you said what it depends on. Do you think that this will happen? I mean, do you think that they will cope with these challenges?
Traditional banks?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I think so, absolutely. It of course will very much depend on what their strategy will be, but as you all know, like for example, there's a big M&A industry. And of course, in the end, if they would not be able like to build such a product, they will buy a fintech company. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Of course, this is what will happen after a couple of years. I'm definitely sure. So to answer your question, yes, absolutely. I think there will be like also traditional banks, or that like banks that are traditional banks right now, that will be still there, of course, in 10 years, and that will be still big.
Okay, let's ask Jens Kunz. Is this happening? Banks buying fintechs? Is there a market for this?
Absolutely, absolutely. And not only buying fintechs, also cooperating with fintechs, going into or entering into a cooperation agreement, or or developing a white labeling model where a FinTech company is a service provider of certain services. That's an important field growing now. I mean, that's a win-win situation for the FinTechs and for the banks, because FinTechs need clients, and banks oftentimes have the clients. So a white labeling solution is a perfect fit in this regard. Maybe the margin is not that huge as they would do it alone, but there are various options to cooperate, and these options they are used already.
All right. Okay, so Doris Dietze, I was once on a panel discussion with the parliamentary secretary Jens Spahn of the Ministry of Finance, and he said about the general philosophy of regulating FinTechs. He said, if it does banking, it should be regulated as a bank. Do you agree?
Of course, I agree with my state secretary. So, but I think it was you who put the right question. A bank is everything who has a banking license, and the question is what is behind it. And there we see already a lot of different things. So we see traditional banks, we see something like Solaris, which is a kind of white label bank already, and we will see probably yesterday, and yesterday was the last session or was one of the sessions of the FinTech Rat, and we had a very interesting presentation of a traditional bank, so to say, how they see the future of banking. And they had a really kind of interesting guess that it will not only be about white labeling banking or platform banking or traditional banking, but also the idea that banking as a service on non-banking platforms. So to say, the bank provides a service on an Amazon or eBay platform, for example. So that was very much in the future. I wasn't even 5 years ago able to foresee what has happened since then. So I wouldn't even be able to guess what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I should say this was a mean question. I hope you'll excuse for this. Okay, so I'm just thinking maybe a problem with our discussion and other discussions, for example, in the FinTech Council, is that of survivorship bias, because of course Robert Kilian says regulation is good because obviously you succeeded in coping with all the challenges, and of course you say it's all right. I mean, it could always be better, but it's okay because that's what your clients experience. But your clients, well, at least what I can say about your clients is they have enough money to pay you. So probably they are already a little established and have a little money at hand for legal advice. So who's not represented here, of course, are all the guys who fail. And let's just, I don't think we should exclude the possibility that they fail due to regulatory constraints. So if we assume that this is a possibility, the four of you, what can we do about this? What would you do about this? I mean, you don't have to come up with a full-fledged concept. It's just if you have an idea, that would be much appreciated.
Maybe to give an answer. The thing is, I don't think that if you're doing a startup and if you have founders really believing that they have an idea that or that they have a solution that the world really needs, then in their minds there shouldn't be, as a first step, there shouldn't be like in their head like something like, or how can we tackle this regulatory problem? That's my view, to be very honest, because that's of course it's very, very important, and of course that's the reason why we're all here. That's the reason why there are lawyers. That's the reason why there are in-house counsel. That's the reason why we have supervisory authority, and so on and so on. But if you see like really the company, and let's take this maybe to a more higher level. Then I think and I guess that was the question maybe a little bit, then I think we should not look at like what is the regulatory constraints here. We should more like look at, is this something where founders of a company with a big idea, where they could be concerned that this is a topic, giving the fact or giving the requirement that of course they have good lawyers, that they have good in-house counsel, that they really have a good contact to the supervisory authorities. And if everything like that is given, and I think that's actually the case in Germany right now, then we have no burden, I think, here. Was that the answer to your question, or I don't know?
Yeah, but I mean, then you say basically without these funds, it's hard to do it, and to convince someone to give you enough money to set up a legal department might not be that easy.
That's totally right. And that's also, of course, you need, of course, like founders and shareholders of a company, also of a smaller company, of a fintech or a startup, that are really willing also to invest, of course, into legal resources. Absolutely, I'm totally with you. But the good thing is, of course, most of the founders and most of the shareholders that I met in the startup area in Berlin, but also Europe-wide, they're not dumb. So they absolutely know that if you're doing a business, a company, a startup, especially a fintech in a highly regulated business, then of course you need to shift some resources to a legal department, some resources to external lawyers. But what I wanted to say, and I think that's the point, is if they really did this, if they have this in their mind, then I think it's also the task of a good legal department and the task of a good external counsel to really not let that too much influencing the view and not too much influencing the perspective of the founders, but more like to keep it into the legal department, to keep it into the legal discussions, and of course like inform them, report them, everything that is necessary when it comes to a shareholder reporting or to MD reporting, whatever. Of course we will do this, but I'm also thinking that if you really want to have, in a startup business especially, if you want to have like creativity, and if you want to like really build a great product, then of course in a highly regulated framework, it's about regulatory law, of course, absolutely. But let's not forget here, it's about the product and building a product, building a good product, having good customer experience, having good customer support. There are so much areas in a company that we right now, as we are sitting here, of course, in a law faculty, that we maybe forget a little bit then.
Okay. Anyone else? I don't.
I mean, I agree. It's a general problem of funding, and this problem can be tackled by creating a special ecosystem. And I think we are on a good way. But I think also some steps have to be taken to create atmosphere or an environment that funders invest in fintechs or in startups generally. But it's, from my point of view, not a particular regulatory issue.
Okay, that would actually have been my next question. Let's talk about funds, the accessibility, the availability of funds. You just mentioned it, but would you say, I mean, that's a common complaint which is also voiced, that in Germany we just don't have too much of a startup culture, especially venture capital funds or venture capitalists who are willing to take risks and fund risky businesses. Would you agree?
Well, I'm not an expert in venture capital financing, but my colleagues are, and what they are telling me is there are a lot of funders available. Maybe the demand is greater than the supply, and we are definitely not in the USA or in UK. It could be better. Yeah, that's for sure.
Maybe I can also step in here. Like, of course, I'm totally with Jens when we say it's not comparable to what we see in the valley. Of course, there you have like 2 roads with basically, I don't know, 200 venture capital funds door by door, and they can all fund $1 billion. Yeah? It's crazy. Of course, the investment field or the investment environment that we see there, it's much better. But one thing is, of course, like don't forget, please do not forget that if you have a good product here, and if you have a good so-called FinTech here in Germany, then of course also these funds from the Valley, they are approaching you. And
so they are scanning the German market?
And that's the point. They come to Berlin, of course, and I can really say that Berlin is totally on their map, absolutely. Maybe next to Tel Aviv, London, of course. But Berlin is totally on the map, and especially the environment that we have here, and I'm not talking about regulation then, but especially the environment that we have here when it comes to office space, when it comes to low rents compared to London or the Valley, when it comes to HR, like simply to the fact recruiting, Berlin is like perfect. Absolutely, yeah. Because we have, as you all know, and this is maybe outraging here the topic, but as you all know, like Berlin is like famous all over the world, and the people want to come here. So if you want to have like tech guys from India, tech guys from Korea, of course they're coming here not only because like N26, for example, is like maybe the nicest fintech in Europe, but they come here also for Berlin, of course. So I think the environment overall is like Berlin is like really on the map also. If you look at investors out of the Silicon Valley. Yeah.
How do they do it? How do they get the information? How do they know what startups are worth looking at? Those funds in the US?
It's of course like it's about connections. On the one hand, of course, you see like venture capital funding also is heavily like relating on connections between the venture capital funds, of course, between startups, and once you have a fund, and what normally happens is a fintech and every startup company, how do they normally start? They start normally with a funding by the founders, or they start with a funding by, I don't know, some relatives, and then they start to grow. And once they have the Series A or the Series B, which means like the funding rounds, then of course they have the first shareholders. And after that, it's of course like that you see the shareholders, of course, that have a big interest that this company is like will grow and grow and grow. They will absolutely took a huge effort to connect everybody in the fintech world. And if you see the fintech world, like the London, Berlin, and Valley, the Valley fintech world, of course, there are many people working in it, of course, right now, because fintech is a huge topic these days. But still, if you're good connected, I think, and if you have a nice product and a good in a nice company, then they totally have you on your map.
Okay. I'll turn to regulatory questions soon, but since we're talking about capital, let's maybe address one issue. I was at a conference at Oxford University earlier this year, and there was an economist who said, startup finance is not the biggest problem in Europe, it's scale-up finance. So it's not seed capital, it's funds needed by companies to become what's called unicorns, these privately held companies valued over 1 billion. Those funds are even scarcer than venture capital, seed finance, startup finance. My first question to Doug, from a global perspective, from a Canadian perspective, North American perspective, do you agree?
Well, that's certainly a popular thing to talk about, but stepping back a sec, you know, with this common complaint that most people don't get venture capital finance, it's good to keep in mind that even in the US, the largest VC market in the world, you only have 0.2% of companies actually ever get venture capital. So it's a teeny fraction of companies ever get venture capital. The fraction's smaller in other countries. And the result of that is that there's typically enormous amounts of political pressure from folks that don't get served by the private VCs to create government-subsidized venture capital, which I'm aware there's a fairly significant presence in Germany, as there is in other places like Canada. And the result of that is that you often have VCs that are not quite the vehicles that the private VCs are, for instance, in terms of their incentives, in terms of how many companies that they end up financing, political incentives to finance companies that perhaps shouldn't be financed. So it does create some conflicts of interest that in turn lead to differential needs when it comes to that scale-up stage. And the comment that you had made earlier about, if you're an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, it's quite different than, say, being here because you face rent issues, human resource issues. People in Silicon Valley have basically zero loyalty. And I know VCs in Toronto love to talk about the fact that the labor market is infinitely better in Toronto than there for those reasons, for managing your startup issues. Now, the scale-up thing often comes, the problems not necessarily come with a capital problem, but it comes with an issue of talent and what the folks at the entity are doing at the startup stage is rather different than what you need people to be doing at that scale-up stage. And so that what I've seen is more common, the issue that comes up, because there are so many variety of ways to get a business to that next stage, and it doesn't need to be through some unicorn type investment. It can come through a whole host of other different ways, and if the internal resources are in place, that's more the exception than the norm.
Okay. Jens Kunz, do your clients complain about not being able to get finance rounds finished off of, let's say, I don't know, 20 million, 100 million, 30 million, those scale-up dimensions?
Well, in the FinTech industry, these are numbers which are, at least at this stage, not really usual. Okay. I mean, what we just have seen is an investment in Scalable that was remarkable. I mean, we didn't advise on it, so we can speak about it. But I think that was almost the highest investment in the last month.
How big was it?
Well,
if it's publicly known.
The exact number, I think, is not.
Okay. Okay. All right.
But
okay.
It was a significant amount.
Okay. Okay. Robert,
double-digit million.
Double. Okay. So you might be a. I don't know when I once I knew when a company qualifies as a scale-up. I just hypothesize that number 26 does qualify as a scale-up. Are you afraid you won't be able to get enough money to compete with the big guys in 2 years or 3 years when it comes to market consolidation?
No, not really. So I think what every company does, and every startup does, is of course you have the idea and you have a business plan, and you simply stick to the business plan. So you also relate your funding to the business plan. Of course, we have special situation with us because we're highly regulated and we are a bank, of course. So we have other capital requirements in place. But when it comes simply to the business and what we plan as a strategy for the products and stuff like that. Then I think we simply relate to that and not so much looking after the probable fact that in 2 or 3 years we could have not enough money to compete with others. It's more like looking at the own product and to foresee what do we want to have, what new features do we want to have, and how do they need to be funded. And at the end, there should be the most nicest product. So I think it's not very much related to the fact that you look at others basically saying, okay, in 2 or 3 years we can't compete with them with the product if we not getting today 100 million or whatever.
Okay, all right. So let's finally turn to regulatory issues again. Doris, Dietze, we have talked about the regulatory environment, and we are all quite optimistic about it, but we all agree that it can always be better. I guess one question is, to what extent is the German legislator, does the German legislator still have the competence to regulate, and to what extent would the European Union be the right guys to ask, and if it's a matter of European law, what does the German legislator or the Ministry of Finance do to influence this decision-making process on the EU level?
Yes, of course, our national legislator has always the power to legislate. Nevertheless, especially in the field of financial services, there are a lot of areas which are covered by European legislation. To a certain extent or degree, one have to say. There are some areas which are fully harmonized, which is the payments area, for example. And then there are some areas which are not that far harmonized, where you have national legislation in place, like the crowd investing or funding part. So that is why we, of course, in all areas, watch closely and also cooperate closely with the European Commission to get an idea what is coming up and to discuss the things. We are part, of course, all our European legislation got negotiated in the Council working groups where experts are sitting during the negotiations and where European or Commission proposals often get changed. More or less substantial, but there's often changes that weren't there at the beginning when the first proposal was published by the Commission. Of course, then you have the European Parliament, which also has certain ideas and also changes the first proposal. So this is the legislative part, so to say. And next to it, we have a lot of working groups. The Commission is very keen on getting expertise from the national, from the member states as well. And we are very keen on letting them or share our expertise with them. So next to official working groups on certain issues, we also have national experts in the Commission. Every member state has that. It's nothing typical. And yes, so these are the normal ways how we communicate.
All right. Okay. So let's just stay at the European level for a second. So if I put myself into the shoes of an economist, of a pessimistic economist, I would tell you the following story. So here we have the EU. We have this huge apparatus called the European Commission. And this is a huge bureaucracy, and there are sitting these bureaucrats, and everyone wants to make a career. And the way of doing this is to propose a nice piece of regulation. And if you get this through on the European level, then you make this is a necessary requirement to move up the career ladder. And Germany cannot do anything about this because it's European law. And if the Commission has a certain competence, member states cannot regulate. It's impossible. And if they do, the EU law would still prevail. So I guess one of the threats, especially in the realm of financial regulation, is that you just have these overly ambitious bureaucrats. I overstate this case a little, okay, just to be a little provocative. These overly ambitious bureaucrats who just keep regulating and regulating, and the costs are borne by especially the industry participants in the member states. And if you think about MiFID II, for example, a legal act with, I don't know, 95 delegated legal acts on level 2 of the Lamfalussy-Verfahren, it's crazy. And that's what all the participants tell you. So is there a way, am I right in this very pessimistic description? Maybe let's start with this.
I think you have a point, and there are various reasons for this trend, so to speak. The one is the financial crisis. That was a starter for regulation, of course. Maybe in 5 or 6, 7 years, it will go back, like maybe in the US right now.
May I just say, there's one thing I can tell you about the regulator. The regulator always regulates more, never less.
Yeah, well, the regulator, but there's also the legislator. But as I said, you have a point, and we could start by considering if it really makes sense to have the ECB and EBA, because there's, well, from my perception, a sort of unclear relationship between both authorities, and the one says that, and then ECB thinks, well, I should also say something to this topic. If this makes sense, I don't know. And then the trend, and maybe it's really something which the legislator took care of, is if it really makes sense to regulate in such detail, like in MiFID II, and then it's not the legislator making the rules, but ESMA in the MiFID II context. And then in a way that you can really raise the question whether this is in line with the intention of the directive. So there are certain aspects where they make their own law. That's my perception. And there should be at least a discussion that goes also in the relation to proportionality, as we just touched upon, but also how law in the financial sector should be made, I think.
What's your take, Doris, Dietze? Did I overstate the case of overregulation?
Well, I would say you shouldn't underestimate the power of the European Parliament and the European Council when it comes to European legislation. And they have I think, a close look on the economic impacts as well, and what it means for the local markets, because every European parliamentarian has to go back to his home country in one time. And so that is one point. And the other point is it's always easy to blame the regulator, because it's always easy to say what could have been better. It's not possible to say what could have been done worse. So, well, for me, I of course do not share your view in that regard, because, yeah, as I said, it's easy to blame the regulator afterwards. It's most of the time very difficult to do it better, or to see what could have gone worse, which would be the other side of the medal.
Okay.
If I can jump in. So even though there's harmonized regulations through the EU, what we often see in the data and enforcement statistics is that there's differential enforcement, whether it be MAD or MiFID, that as two examples that they're vastly different enforcement. The other thing I wanted to touch base on is you said that regulators always regulate more, never less. Well, actually, occasionally they regulate less. But the interesting thing about that is that once there's less regulation, say take disclosure, where occasionally disclosure obligations have gone down, firms are loath to start disclosing less. So once there's sort of a standard in place, and it's not like you take away the regulation, people are going to disclose less, because that's a huge negative signal for the marketplace participants. So it's more of a, there's a very sort of permanence in putting in place a standard. So kind of neat.
All right. Well, thank you. Okay, so for the very last question, maybe just as there is a famous German TV show, I don't even know, is it Plasberg? I don't have a TV, I might add. So I'll just very short answer for the very last question. So everyone gets the same question, and I hope it's not too cheesy. But let's say, so the best thing about FinTech is, Robert,
getting great products for the customers.
Okay.
To increase the innovative potential of Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the focus on the customer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, kill the mutual funds and I'll be way better off. No, if I could say two things. The academic side, we have a lifetime of new things to study, so it's brilliant.
That's right. All right, well, thank you very much for this great discussion.